A rural Pennsylvania doctor received a house call in the winter of 1891, an event that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Arriving at the isolated farmstead, he discovered a family that simply looked wrong. Not sick, not injured, but fundamentally wrong. Their eyes were set too far apart, their fingers bent at angles anatomy would not allow, and when they spoke, the sound suggested they were just beginning to learn language. The doctor never filed an official report. He never shared a word of what he witnessed. However, 80 years after his passing, his private journal was found, containing a single sentence: "I have seen the consequence of a bloodline that was never meant to continue." This is the disturbing account of the Wardwell family, and the damage 7 generations of intentional isolation inflicted on their DNA. Hello everyone. Before we dive into the story, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and let us know your location and the time you're watching in the comments. This helps YouTube keep showing you compelling stories like this one. The Wardwell family wanted neither to be found nor to have visitors. They rejected any offer of help. For nearly 200 years, they existed on 400 acres of dense woodland in the Appalachian foothills, miles away from the nearest town. No one could say for certain how many of them there were. Census takers who dared venture onto the property reported figures watching from the tree line, but they never came closer. Mail carriers quickly left packages at the edge of the dirt road before driving away. The few neighbors living within 5 miles learned not to pose questions, because the Wardwells followed a rule, passed down from one generation to the next: the bloodline stays pure. The family stays together. No one leaves. No one enters. And, most critically, no one marries outside the family. What began in the 1790s as a form of religious isolation evolved into something far more sinister, something that biologically twisted their very existence. By the time authorities were finally compelled to intervene in 1968, the Wardwell family had become a genetic case study in the consequences of breeding human beings like livestock. And the outcome was more troubling than anyone could have imagined. The Wardwell family's narrative starts in 1792, when a former Quaker minister named Ezekiel Wardwell purchased a vast area of wilderness land in what would later become western Pennsylvania. Ezekiel had been excommunicated from his congregation for propagating what he termed the doctrine of sacred preservation. He held the conviction that God had specifically chosen certain families to remain unsullied by the corruption of the outside world. He believed that intermingling bloodlines with outsiders was a form of spiritual contamination, and that his family had been selected for a divine purpose that necessitated absolute genetic purity. Ezekiel brought with him his wife, Sarah, and their 6 children. They constructed a compound deep within the forest, far from established settlements or roads. Then, Ezekiel made a fateful decision that would curse his descendants for 2 centuries. He declared his children would only marry one another. Initially, this was justified using religious language. Ezekiel claimed God had ordained sibling marriages in the Bible, referencing the children of Adam and Eve, the pharaohs of Egypt, and isolated, selectively interpreted passages in Leviticus that no scholar would endorse. His children, raised in total isolation and taught that the world outside was full of temptation and demons, accepted his words. The eldest daughter married the eldest son. The second daughter married the second son. And when children were born from these unions, they were indoctrinated with the very same doctrine. The family tree did not branch out, it perpetually twisted back on itself, generation after generation, much like a snake consuming its own tail. By the 1830s, the Wardwell family had grown to nearly 40 members, all residing on the same property, all descendants of Ezekiel and Sarah. But problems were already manifesting. A traveling preacher who visited the compound in 1834 recorded in his diary that he had never before witnessed so many children with physical deformities in a single location. Several children had club feet. Others suffered from severe underbites, making eating a challenge. One young girl's eyes pointed in opposing directions. When the preacher cautiously suggested that the family might consider allowing marriages with outsiders, Ezekiel's grandson, who was now the family patriarch, ordered him off the property at gunpoint. The Wardwells didn't interpret these conditions as defects. They viewed them as tests of faith, as evidence that God was refining them through suffering. Consequently, the isolation persisted, the marriages continued, and with the passage of each generation, the genetic damage intensified. By the time the Civil War concluded, the Wardwell family had entered what geneticists would later label a genetic bottleneck crisis. 3 generations of successive inbreeding had virtually eliminated their genetic diversity. Every hidden mutation, every dormant defect, every recessive gene that might have remained harmless in a normal population was now expressing itself with ruthless efficiency. The family members were no longer merely physically unusual. They were becoming something medicine had never adequately documented. A photograph from 1889, found in a local historical society's archives, depicts 7 Wardwell children positioned in front of their cabin. At first glance, it appears to be a typical pioneer family portrait, but upon closer inspection, certain features emerge. The children's heads are disproportionately large for their bodies. Their ears are positioned unusually low on their skulls. 3 of them share a distinctive gap between their front teeth, wide enough to insert a finger. And their eyes, all of them, possess a vacant, unsettling quality that the camera captured with clarity. The doctor who visited in 1891 offered further details in his journal. He described a family where nearly every member exhibited some degree of cognitive impairment. Even simple conversations proved difficult. Many spoke a dialect so warped that neighboring Pennsylvania Dutch speakers could not comprehend it. He observed that many adults had never learned to count beyond 10, and most were unable to write their own names. Yet, what troubled him the most was the physical examination he was permitted to perform on one young man, about 20 years old. The man's skeletal structure was abnormal. His rib cage was asymmetrical. His joints were hypermobile, bending backward in a manner suggesting connective tissue disorders. Furthermore, looking into his mouth, the doctor counted 34 teeth, several of which were growing in locations where teeth should never appear. The doctor's journal entry concluded with a medical opinion that was both professional and profoundly unsettling. This family suffers from what I can only describe as cumulative hereditary degeneration. Each generation appears to inherit the defects of all preceding generations, compounded and intensified. If this trend continues, I cannot fathom what the 4th or 5th generation from now will look like. I suspect they will cease to be viable as a population within 50 years. He was incorrect about the time frame. The Wardwells would endure for another 77 years, but his prediction concerning viability would prove chillingly accurate. What allowed the Wardwell family to remain concealed for so long was not just their remote location. It was a deliberate, synchronized effort by the family's elders to maintain absolute secrecy regarding the condition of their bloodline. By the early 1900s, the family had developed an elaborate system to evade outside scrutiny. They kept a few members, those who looked the most normal, as intermediaries with the outside world. These designated family representatives would visit town once or twice a year to purchase necessities, always paying in cash and keeping all interactions brief. They would assure shopkeepers that the family was doing well, that yes, there were new babies, and that everyone was healthy and content. Meanwhile, back on the compound, the reality was becoming increasingly horrifying. Birth defects were no longer the exception, they were the standard. Infant mortality had sharply risen, and the family had begun practicing something even their twisted religious reasoning could no longer justify. They were now arranging marriages between parents and children, between uncles and nieces, between any pairing that could still produce offspring. A social worker's report from 1923, buried in county records and only rediscovered in the 1990s, offers a rare glimpse into what authorities suspected but could not confirm. A local teacher had reported that several Wardwell children, who occasionally appeared in town, exhibited signs of severe neglect and abuse. When a social worker attempted to visit the property, she was met at the boundary line by 3 men carrying rifles. They informed her that the family did not recognize the authority of the government, that they lived solely under God's law, and that if she returned, she would be considered a trespasser. The social worker noted in her report that she could distinctly hear children's voices coming from deeper within the woods, and that the sounds they were making didn't resemble normal children playing. She wrote, "There was a quality to their voices, a kind of atonal wailing that made me feel I was listening to something I shouldn't be hearing." The few outsiders who did manage to catch sight of the family shared stories that were widely dismissed as rural legends or exaggerations. A mailman claimed he once saw a teenage girl near the property line who had 6 fingers on each hand. A hunter, lost in the woods, reported stumbling across a Wardwell family gathering and observing at least 24 individuals, many of whom moved with strange, shuffling gaits, and several who seemed to have difficulty holding their heads upright. These accounts circulated in church basements and local taverns, but they never reached official channels, because in rural Pennsylvania during the 1920s and 30s, people generally minded their own business. If a family wished to live in isolation, to keep to themselves, and to maintain traditions outsiders found strange, that was considered their right. America was, after all, founded on the principle that a man's property was his kingdom. No one wanted to admit that some kingdoms were built on horror. By the 1940s, the Wardwell family had established a 2-tier system. There were the town faces, family members functional enough to pass as normal, who handled all external contact. And then there were the others, those who never left the compound, whose very existence was never officially recorded. Birth certificates were rarely filed, deaths were never reported. The family had become masters at operating entirely outside the legal system. They buried their dead on their land. They delivered their own babies. And when those babies were born with conditions too severe to survive, the family managed it privately, leaving no witnesses and no paper trail. A former county clerk, interviewed in 1972, recalled a peculiar detail from her time working in the records office during the 1950s. She mentioned that every few years, a Wardwell family member would come in to register a birth, always a single child, always described as normal and healthy. But she observed something odd. The parents' names on these certificates cycled through the same few names generation after generation: Jonathan, Ezekiel, Samuel for the men, Sarah, Rebecca, Mercy for the women. It appeared the family was only registering just enough births to maintain a legal pretense of normalcy, while the actual, hidden population grew uncounted in the shadows. What was life actually like for the children growing up in that compound, completely cut off from the rest of the world? We possess only fragments. A journal recovered from the property after the family was finally dispersed contains entries written in a childish hand, complete with misspellings. One entry, dated 1951, reads, "Mama says I am special because I have the mark of the family. The mark is why my eyes don't look the same way. Brother says it's because God is watching both paths at once through me. I am 7, but I do not know numbers past 7. Mama says numbers are for the outside, and we don't need the outside." Another entry, possibly written years later by the same child. "The new baby came last night. It cried different than babies should cry. Papa took it to the backfield. We don't talk about the backfield. If you're still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your own bloodline." The compound itself, according to photographs taken after its abandonment, was a sprawling collection of structures that had been haphazardly added onto over decades. The main house, a 3-story wooden structure, had been expanded so many times that it looked like several buildings had collided with one another. There were additions built onto additions, rooms only accessible by crawling through others, and staircases that led nowhere. Inside, investigators found living conditions best described as medieval. There was no running water, and electricity only appeared in the 1950s, and even then, only in certain rooms. Sleeping areas involved a dozen people sharing the same space, and everywhere, on walls, doors, and furniture, were carved symbols and biblical passages warning of the outside world's corruption and the sacred duty of family preservation. The Wardwell family secret might have continued indefinitely if not for one individual, Catherine Wardwell, born in 1946. Catherine was one of the town faces, functional enough to occasionally leave the property, genetically fortunate enough to appear mostly normal. In 1967, at the age of 21, Catherine did what no Wardwell had dared to do in over a century: she ran away. She managed to reach a town 50 miles from the compound, walked into a police station, and told them everything. The officers who took her statement initially dismissed her story. It sounded like something out of a Gothic novel, too disturbing to be factual. But Catherine had proof. She had smuggled out photographs. She possessed documents detailing the marriages between close relatives. And, most compellingly, she had herself. When doctors examined her, they found evidence of genetic abnormalities consistent with multigenerational inbreeding, unusual bone structure, minor organ displacement, and cognitive processing difficulties that made complex mathematics and reading nearly impossible, despite her apparent intelligence. The authorities acted slowly. This was not a situation covered in any manual. How do you legally intervene in a family that had been isolated for nearly 200 years? What legal framework was even applicable? For months, social workers and law enforcement debated jurisdiction, authority, and approach. All the while, Catherine lived in protective custody, consumed by fear that her family would locate her and drag her back. She confided in psychiatrists about her childhood, describing a life surrounded by relatives who ranged from mildly impaired to completely non-functional. She recounted how the family elders selected breeding pairs based on interpretations of dreams and biblical passages. She spoke of children born with conditions so severe they could not properly breathe or eat, and how the family simply allowed them to die, believing it to be God's will. And she revealed a detail that made the case even more urgent: she was pregnant. She had been pregnant when she fled, carrying a child conceived from a union with her own uncle, a match arranged by the family patriarch when she was 19. In March of 1968, a convoy of social workers and police cars descended upon the Wardwell property. What they encountered surpassed their worst imaginings. The family had swelled to 87 members, spanning 6 living generations. Of those 87 individuals, only about 15 were capable of independent living by any normal standard. The rest existed in various states of physical and cognitive impairment. There were adults who had never acquired the ability to speak. Children with skeletal deformities so severe they could not walk. Multiple cases of microcephaly, a condition where the brain and skull failed to develop properly. Several family members suffered from severe vision problems, including 2 who were entirely blind from congenital conditions. The genetic damage was so extensive that medical researchers who later studied the family declared it one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding depression ever documented in humans. The family patriarch, Samuel Wardwell, the great-great-great-grandson of Ezekiel, was 73 years old. When police attempted to arrest him for child abuse, neglect, and multiple violations of marriage laws, he appeared genuinely confused. He insisted they had violated no laws because they did not live under man's law. He maintained that the family was fulfilling a divine covenant. As they led him away in handcuffs, he incessantly repeated the same 3 words: "The blood stays pure. The blood stays pure. The blood stays pure." The dissolution of the Wardwell family was a humanitarian and bureaucratic nightmare that would require years to fully resolve. The family members were scattered across 3 states, placed in hospitals, group homes, psychiatric facilities, and foster care. Many had never encountered electric lights, television, or automobiles up close. The transition to modern life proved impossible for most of them. Medical examinations revealed the complete scope of the genetic disaster. Researchers from the University of Pennsylvania and Johns Hopkins, with the family's consent, came to study them, and their findings effectively rewrote the understanding of how profoundly inbreeding could damage a human population. The Wardwells suffered from a constellation of disorders rarely seen together: hemophilia, albinism in several members, cleft palates, heart defects, kidney malformations, and neurological conditions with no official names. Their DNA exhibited homozygosity rates, meaning identical gene pairs from both parents, at levels approaching theoretical maximums. Simply put, their genetic diversity had so thoroughly collapsed that most family members were as genetically similar to one another as identical twins. But the most troubling discoveries were neurological. Cognitive testing and CT scans showed that generations of inbreeding had severely impacted brain development across the family. Many members had brain volumes smaller than the average. Others showed unusual brain structures, with parts of the brain that should have developed normally being severely underdeveloped or simply absent. IQ testing, while complicated by their complete lack of formal education, suggested that the average Wardwell family member functioned at a level comparable to a child between the ages of 6 and 8, regardless of their actual age. A few, like Catherine, were higher functioning, but many existed in a perpetual fog of confusion, unable to grasp abstract concepts, time, or cause and effect. They had been effectively bred into a state of permanent childhood generation after generation, until the family had created its own subspecies of humanity, one that could barely survive without constant care. Samuel Wardwell died in custody in 1969 before a trial could take place. He suffered a massive stroke and never woke up. The few family members capable of understanding what had occurred expressed not relief for their rescue, but profound grief for the loss of the only life they had ever known. Several attempted to return to the compound, which the state had seized. They stood at the property line, now marked with "No Trespassing" signs, and wept for the world they had been taken from. To them, the intervention was not salvation, it was the destruction of everything their ancestors had built and everything they had been taught was sacred. Catherine Wardwell gave birth to a daughter in June of 1968. The child was born with multiple congenital defects and passed away 3 days later. Catherine never attempted to have another child. She spent the rest of her life, until her death in 2003, collaborating with psychologists and geneticists to document what had transpired in her family. She wanted the world to grasp not just the biology, but the psychology of the situation, how a family could convince itself that its own destruction was, in fact, divine will. The Wardwell compound was demolished in 1974. The land was eventually sold and today is part of a state forest. There is no plaque, no historical marker, nothing to signify what took place there. The family's story was intentionally buried in confidential medical files and sealed court records. Most of the surviving family members have since passed away. A small handful remain alive, living in care facilities under assumed names, their true identities protected by privacy laws. The last known Wardwell, a woman born in 1963, died in 2019. With her passing, the bloodline that Ezekiel Wardwell so fiercely fought to keep pure finally ended. It did not end through outside contamination, but through the inevitable collapse that occurs when human beings try to defy the fundamental rules of biology. The Wardwell family spent 7 generations attempting to breed themselves into purity. Instead, they bred themselves into extinction. And somewhere in those Pennsylvania woods, on land where no one builds anymore, the unmarked graves of countless children remain. They are the final testament to a family that believed isolation was godliness, and discovered too late that isolation is destruction.